fairly homogeneous. And as you mentioned, the stringers as well. This is actually, as a battlefield, this is a fairly unbalanced one. This is another aspect that we have to bring in. You know, foreign journalists might work with Israelis, but they're not all going to have the same view. And they're not all going to be fans of the Israeli government. That does not happen on the other side. So it is even more important to get the right information, to get the right materials, to get the right talking heads to foreign correspondents so that we can adjust some of that balance.
David from Tel Aviv, Marcus, is asking you, Marcus, how do you reconcile your position as a reserve officer in the IDF Speakers Unit with your work at the Israel Project?
Right, IDF Spokesperson's Unit. They call me up and I go, I'm an Israeli citizen. So, you know, I don't need to reconcile or otherwise.
That's your answer.
I can't think of another one
that
makes any more sense.
An upside-down smiley face.
Hello, David.
David,
I probably know you, but as you know, when you get the Sav Shimona, as it's called, you go.
We're going to take a different turn now, and we just have about 20 minutes left. I would like to say, for years, people have complained that they're just sick of hearing about the conflict, saying they just don't want to hear about it anymore. But that never really happens. Israel is always front-page news. Do you think one day we might find ourselves out of the front page? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And what circumstances might that happen? David?
One word before David.
Peace.
Yeah.
Yes.
Peace is the word.
That's the answer.
Well, you can elaborate, but I mean, you know, journalists, are supposed to sort of love the news. Newspaper editors, right? We want news. We live for the news. I don't think that's the case in Israel. Personally, you know, when you have editorial meetings in the afternoon and there are maybe 11 stories that you think really need to be on page one, that's not a good situation. I'd much rather be in a situation where we really don't know what to put on the front page, or we don't really know what to put high on the website because there's so little that's happening today.
You don't mean that.
No, I truly do, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think people are sick of the conflict. I think around the world people are basically saying a plague on all their houses, you know, to hell with all of them. But that's a terrible Israeli failure. We have lost a great deal of what ought to have been instinctive support from around the world. In fact, I would say moderates on both sides have lost a great deal of what ought to be instinctive support around the world. People are fed up with this, and it won't change unless or until that there is peace. I just want to ask you something very quick. I'm really surprised by what you said, Arad, about that we didn't really show. You feel that on Channel 2. I assume you speak for the other channels as well.
Other channels
that they didn't show the war on Israel
Yep.
TV. I find that very surprising. I mean, obviously, as a consumer of all the channels, I think I had a pretty good impression of what was going on in the war and drew conclusions, from what I was watching as well as from particular access that I had. But you think Israelis were denied an accurate sense of what was playing out in the war? And if the answer to that is yes, by the way, you're not state TV. Why?
As I said, we're not state TV, but we are TV of the audience. We consider ourselves as an Israeli TV who broadcast to the Israeli public. And we wanted to fulfill the needs of the Israeli public for certain information. Now, the perception was that the Israeli public, while sitting in these chadarim muganim, in these protected rooms, sealed rooms, did not want to see suffering on the other side, did not want to see kids being killed on the other side. And we showed it. We showed it for 3 minutes out of a bulletin of 90 minutes.
Is that not terribly irresponsible? If you take the view, and by the way, I think there's an argument to be made that in both of our recent wars, the first few days were extremely successful, quote unquote, in terms of achieving their aim, and then they became increasingly problematic, practically speaking, in terms of what they were achieving. If you failed to give Israelis an honest sense of what was going on there, aren't you sort of failing the democracy here because you weren't empowering the people to see what was being done in their name? And isn't that something that should worry you?
It does worry me.
David, would you like to switch seats?
No, I'll shut up now. I know I can hear myself doing that interview thing. I'm sorry.
I cried about it in real time. I cry about it now. This shouldn't have happened, but as we were accused, the Israelis were accused of being disproportionate in the way they reacted. I accused the Israeli media, at least the electronic media, even I did not follow the JP during the war, I admit that, but even the print media of being disproportionate regarding the coverage they do. They covered the Israeli side with an emphasis they did not give on to the other side. And one last example, the Israeli media was looking for victims, and luckily we had very few victims. Television needs blood. Luckily, we did not have blood. So during I can't recall what day it was, there was a baby 3 months old in Gedera who was scratched during one of these Qassams that came from Gaza, and this was breaking news, and we followed this poor baby for hours because suddenly we had a kid of our own on our side. Luckily, this was the only one.
You make a very good point. If it bleeds, it leads, and if it doesn't bleed,
Totally,
what are you going to do with
Yep.
it? But what you as journalists can do to address that issue, being in Ashkelon, being in Sderot during the war, all you had to do was look at the fear on the faces of those kids when the sirens went off.
We brought it. The Israeli media.
I think we're missing a really important point here. We're missing the point.
Counts too.
I think you're being too hard on yourself, and I think we're all missing the point about the asymmetry between a tyrannical, dictatorial, terrorist regime that does not allow free access and Israel's democracy. You would have had plenty of really good footage if there was a democracy on the other side of the border, showing what Hamas was doing, showing the Hamas leadership that had taken over the hospital, showing that Hamas fighters were fighting out of uniform. It wasn't that you didn't have you had a problem with footage from the Palestinian side. You had a problem with accurate footage from the Palestinian side, and all you would have been showing would have been the very carefully manufactured
David,
Gaza
there's
material.
another side to that problem, which is Al Jazeera clearly was there, but the BBC had a crew there too. There were quite a few foreign crews in Gaza, no matter what anybody says, during the course of the war. Why did we not see a Hamas gunman? Why did we not see a Hamas rocket launcher? Not Iran's fault, not Israel TV's fault, not your fault. Why was that not put on television by the foreign media?
Presumably, because, first of all, you're assuming that they had the footage, which I'm not sure about.
I'm
If
assuming
they had the footage and didn't broadcast it, they should close up shop.
They had only.
At the time.
I know the raw footage too,
Yeah.
because I get it from the the stringers material. I get access to. None of this.
Didn't they then have an
But
obligation?
Gentlemen,
it was on the web.
Unfortunately,
Didn't they
we
have
don't.
on
We
the
don't.
web. So why
Marcus,
wasn't
we
it done on
don't. We don't
television?
have any foreign media really represented here, which
Which means that we're
We're
attacking
just
them without
talking
any
ourselves.
response.
that's fine.
The question is, if that's the case, didn't they have an obligation, like in the era of the first Gulf War, of saying this report, the BBC, CNN, compiled under the limitations of whatever wording you want to use. We can't operate freely in Gaza. They didn't convey that
because
sense.
those limitations were imposed by a democratic regime, and these limitations were imposed by a tyrannic regime.
Zimbabwe?
Iraq and I think
Zimbabwe,
not. I think it's
they
very
had that
similar.
rider every time.
Yeah,
It's not
I
a
think it's very
democratic regime.
Arad,
by
are there
default.
any other places, conflict zones that are similar to Israel that run their media in a more efficient way, in a different way that we could look to?
Well, I think that still the media in Israel is one of the most of the freest in the world,
Especially
really.
in the region, for sure.
In the world. I'm talking in the whole world, and I use the example of the embedded journalism in Iraq. In the second Iraq war, there was no free reporting by American media, and the American media all accepted it. They cry, rightly so, when there are imposed when there are restrictions imposed in Israel. They should cry, but I didn't see any free reporting from Iraq by American media, by British media, by any other media who had troops over there. They played the game in the very same way they were dictated to do it. The Israeli media and the foreign press here in general is free to act almost as they want, and definitely much more than anywhere else in the world, much more than in Russia, much more than in Georgia, much more than in the Balkans, much more than in Africa, much more in any other conflict zones. And I say that with
one American one American columnist came over here, and